I'm really excited to be a part of this. Near the tail end of 1920, an enormous migration was underway. Hundreds of thousands of people had crossed the border of the former Russian Empire, fleeing the Civil War and the fledgling Bolshevik Revolution. Some of them escaped to the east, following anti-Bolshevik military leaders like Admiral Kolchak out of Siberia. Others went through the northwest into Scandinavia or the Baltics with Eugenich's stalled offensive. Many took to ships on the shores of the Black Sea in Crimea, traveling by way of the Bosphorus into other parts of the world. Throngs of people escaped Russia this way. On a single day in November 16th, 1920, 126 ships set out from Crimea, ferrying nearly 150,000 people away from their war-torn homelands. Almost a third of these were soldiers, battle-weary men who fought against the Red Army under General Wrangel. They had finally been beaten back to the shore, left with no choice but to climb onto ships and abandon the vanishing Russian Empire. They traveled from Crimea to places around Constantinople like Lemnos, Gallipoli, and from there they disseminated into the rest of the world. Among them was a man named Major General Anton Nikolai Vsyevolodovich Shinkarenko. 30 years old at the time of his evacuation from Russia in 1920, Shinkarenko had been a soldier for a decade already. A graduate of an artillery school, he spent World War I fighting in the Balkans as part of a mountain cavalry division. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, Shinkarenko was quick to join the volunteer army under General Kornilov. As a Kornilovite and later under Wrangel, Shinkarenko commanded a cavalry brigade and later a division of mountain troops, which earned him the rank of Major General. A skilled tactician and leader, by 1920, Shinkarenko had been awarded the Bulgarian Order of Bravery and the Order of St. Nicholas by his superiors. Even so, on this chilled November day, he found himself climbing onto a ship, never to see his beloved Russia again. From Crimea, Shinkarenko followed a common path for émigrés, cut loose from the world that they had known and set adrift into a new one. They had become part of the Russian diaspora, a multi-ethnic, multinational community of people separated by conflict from their common origin in the Russian Empire. In the early days of the diaspora, many of them gathered in areas fairly close to their former home, like Bulgaria, Turkey, and Germany, places that they could easily access that had cultural and historical connections to Russia, and which they could use as a springboard to make their way to their eventual destinations. From there, they spread across the world, with some 30,000 traveling to the United States, about 120,000 settling in France, and many more establishing homes in China, Manchuria, and other countries across the world. Shinkarenko followed a similar trajectory, first traveling to Serbia and then spending a few years in Germany, before finally settling into the Russian community in Paris. He found it difficult to assimilate, and in fact most had no desire to do so at all. Their expectation was that they would be in exile for a short time until it was safe to return and retake their homeland. They constituted a community separated across vast distances, but bound together by loss and a vision of an eventual restoration. One of the most common ways that these émigrés remained connected to their culture and each other, and their homeland and their past, was through Russian language publications and newspapers produced by fellow émigrés. Many members of the Russian diaspora read and supported these papers as a way of staying aware of current events, as well as keeping tabs on the goings-on in the Soviet Union, all from the émigré perspective. These newspapers were a critical source not only of information, but of identity and community for millions of émigrés, particularly in the first few decades of the diaspora. 15 years after the revolution, when civil war caught fire in Europe once again, this time in Spain, no émigré newspaper was more fervent and consistent in their openly avowed support of Franco's rebellion than Chasovoy. Chasovoy was a prominent émigré newspaper that served, as Russian historian Konstantin Semyonov writes, as, quote, the mouthpiece of military emigration. The paper was edited and published in Paris, later moved to Brussels by a man named V.V. Oryechov. In 1914, Oryechov had left his studies and volunteered to join the Russian Imperial Army, attaining the rank of captain for his services during the First World War. He had taken up arms immediately upon the Bolshevik seizure of power, and fought under General Wrangel alongside Shinkarenko during the Russian Civil War, commanding a company of troops until they were forced to flee, again through Crimea. He contributed to several emigre newspapers, including Возрождение, as well as Galipelets, before finally establishing Chasovoy in 1929. Aryakov was a vocal supporter of Franco's rebellion and of the idea that anti-Bolshevik Russian emigres should be actively working to offer their assistance to Franco and the nationalists. He practiced what he preached as well, resolving to travel to Spain as soon as he could. Unfortunately, the border between Spain and France, where Aryakov had established Chasovoy, was closed soon after the war. Quote, "In the very first month of the Civil War," Aryakov later recalled, "I managed to get a visa to Portugal and from there to national Spain, where in Salamanca I presented myself to General Franco." As a conflict journalist, he was attached to the army of General Varela, observing with awe the organization of the troops as well as the propaganda they produced and distributed among the populations of the regions that they controlled. Aryakov was so enthusiastic about the nationalist and Carlist or monarchist forces in Spain and their struggle against the Republic that he spoke with Franco's headquarters and secured permission for the first Russian volunteers to be smuggled across the border to volunteer. This was not the last time that Aryakov would meet with Franco's officers. The following March, he attended a conference with several captains from the Russian detachment, as well as the Spanish General Grandes, arguing the case of a bond between Russia and Spain. Upon his departure from Spain, Aryakov's efforts to support Franco's rebellion did not cease. It soon became clear, however, that his allegiance to Franco would cause trouble for him in the neutral Popular Front-controlled France. So he moved the headquarters of Chasovoy to Brussels. Working alongside the organizers behind the Russian All-Union, the All-Russian Military Union, as well as the widow of General Wrangel, Aryakov organized and sent a great deal of support materials to the Russian volunteers in Spain. Some of this was financial assistance. He managed to funnel thousands of Belgian francs into Spain and into the hands of the volunteers. He also made sure that they received hundreds of packs of cigarettes, as well as a great deal of Russian language books donated by emigres in Germany. Using funds gathered in Belgium, they managed to send over 2 fully equipped ambulances. And Aryakov was even able to set up a Russian language radio station in Spain for the volunteers, which he established under the Chasovoy name. No less prodigious were his evangelizing efforts through the paper. He published articles reporting on the actions of Franco's troops and referred to the war in Spain as the, quote, Spanish-Soviet War, conflating the Republic and the Soviet Union. Other headlines warned readers of Soviet soldiers in Spain, signs of the Republic's Bolshevization. Articles like, "What kind of army should the future Russia build?" looked forward to that promised march against the Soviet Union to retake the homeland, which was always their ultimate goal. Aryakov even published the occasional letters from Franco expressing his enormous gratitude for Aryakov's and his followers' support, quote, against the Red Horde, plunging Spain into a terrible catastrophe, as well as his appreciation for the journal Chasovoy, which he said was of undeniable importance in our common cause. Franco was not often this deferential toward his Russian allies, so Aryakov's work appears to have made quite the impression on him. Aryakov's devotion to the cause was probably most clearly on display in a piece he wrote for Chasovoy, proclaiming the justification for Russia's emigres to take up arms and fight for Franco's Spain. He ran this piece directly under a photograph of a desecrated Spanish church with bodies and coffins on the front steps, effectively evoking images that his readers would have seen in Russia of Bolsheviks destroying churches and digging up saints. Titling the article "Two Fronts," he claimed that the White armies were opening a second front in their own war for Russia. The Russian Whites, Aryakov argued, had been placed, quote, by the will of fate in a hopeless position, and up to that point could only morally sympathize with the heroic struggle of the Spanish White Army. The Spaniards and the Russians were not foreigners to each other, but comrades, he argued, and those who could had a duty to help. "We do not know how many there are," he implored. But let those who have an opportunity to take part in the struggle against our common enemy receive our warm greetings. And may they pass it on to those Spanish patriots who have raised a new Kornilovite revolt in the name of honor and truth. In Chasavoy, other correspondents followed Aryakov in couching their reports on the Spanish Civil War in the language of the Russian Civil War, drawing connections between the two. One reporter was actually sent to Spain to act as a long-term conflict journalist there, following Franco's armies and reporting back on their activities for their readers. This person's articles were a major ongoing focus of Chasavoy, sometimes netting as many as 5 or 6 pages for a single report. The correspondent maintained the convention of referring to the nationalist forces and territories as, quote, white Spain, and the Republican armies as their territories as the Reds. Never mind that the Carlists, who had much more in common with the émigrés than their Francoist partners, were a small faction among the nationalists. Never mind that the majority of Republicans were not communists, and in fact were wary of Soviet influence despite their dependency on it. These white and red terms, born out of the Russian Civil War, still mapped easily enough onto the conflict as far as these émigré correspondents were concerned. Aryakov wrote another piece that reiterated his call for Russians to make their way to Spain and join the Francoist forces. It bore the relatively uninspired title of More About Spain, but it made certain his view about the true nature of the war and why it should be so critically important for Russian émigrés. The point is not at all about Spain, he wrote, despite the admiration that we experience for the exploits of the Alcazar heroes and the valiant units of Franco. The point is quite different. Russian interest in the Spanish Civil War was not only about a community of exiled people commiserating with the Spaniards who were in the midst of a similar ideological struggle. It was more than that. The Spanish Civil War, for them, was a continuation of the Russian Civil War, a new iteration of that same conflict, simply transplanted to another side of the continent. And any anti-Bolshevik Russian had a duty to pitch in. Franco, Aryakov wrote, was fighting, quote, not only for his Spain, but also for our work, the fight against the Bolsheviks until the complete destruction of the communist infection. In Aryakov's mind, the war was not only the calling of the Spanish Carlists and nationalists, but also the veterans of the Russian Civil War as well. This was a fight against the Bolshevization of Europe, and therefore a special duty of all exiled Russian soldiers. The leadership in the émigré community called Aryakov's call to action, they echoed his call to action and attempted to organize a mass movement of Russian volunteers to join Franco's forces. They hoped to revitalize their union, to reignite their members' enthusiasm for the fight against Bolshevism, and their hope to return to their homeland. General Pavel Shatilov was the most emphatic proponent of intervention in Spain, writing that in Spain, quote, the armed struggle of the whites against the red forces continues. In December of '36, Shatilov even organized a delegation of his own, with help from diplomatic contacts in Rome, to travel to Spain and offer the services of his volunteers. Franco's senior officers accepted the help of Russian volunteers, but would not offer payments to cover travel expenses. If enough volunteers did arrive in Spain, they said, Franco's army would form a Russian unit in the Spanish Foreign Legion. As unenthusiastic as the Francoist leaders were in their offer, it was enough for Shatilov to convince another general, Yevgeny Miller, to issue an order to their entire organization across the globe, calling for volunteers. Miller used the same language as Shatilov and Aryakov, calling the Spanish Civil War, quote, a continuation of the white struggle. And he encouraged all who could to travel to Spain. There were a number of émigrés who were zealous enough to set aside their lives that they had built outside of Russia, sneak across the border into Spain, and volunteer for Franco. No official count was kept, so we don't know how many people traveled over, but Semyonov estimates that around 150 probably actually made it to Spain. Most of these were middle-aged men who had fought in the First World War and the Russian Civil War, rising up to elevated ranks in the Russian army, but who had met with disappointment and disillusionment as émigrés. Nikolai Boltin had become a colonel in the First World War and served as a grenadier in Spain for Franco. Nikolai Selivanov, who would go on to serve in Spain, had been a captain under Yudenich. T.H.I.N.K was a perfect example of the way these men felt emasculated, robbed of power, authority, and adventure by their émigré lives. Though he had been a successful and decorated officer, his days of adventure and battle were far behind the 48-year-old man when civil war broke out in Spain. He was eager to don his cap and uniform to escape the bleak tedium of émigré life and throw himself into battle. He was more than ready to close the door on the, quote, 11 unhappy and friendless years during which he lived in Paris with his aging mother. Another volunteer, Anton Yaremchuk, was just as eager. Having paid off his rent, packed a small suitcase, he made his way for Saragossa as soon as he could. Upon his arrival, he and his companions saw a man wearing a cross, and they rejoiced. "We came from godless France to religious Spain," he later wrote. It was even touching. T.H.I.N.K and Yaremchuk, like so many other Russian émigrés, had never really unpacked their suitcases, so to speak, and, to borrow a phrase from Mark Ryath, simply sat on their trunks and waited for an opportunity to re-enter their war. The first obstacle that the volunteers faced when they tried to join the front was simply reaching Spain. The non-intervention agreement meant that the border between France and Spain was officially closed, so volunteers had to travel in small groups, paying smugglers to lead them across the Pyrenees on foot under cover of night. T.H.I.N.K reached San Sebastian in just such a group, accompanying 2 Russian captains as well as a general who traveled with them. I think I'm running short on time right now, is that right?
About 4 minutes left.
Okay. So this, I think, so I'll just summarize the rest of this then, because I don't want to cut into our time here. What I think I've found here is that these people, they traveled to Spain and they essentially created a connection between Russia and Spain for themselves. This is not something that was shared by the Spaniards that they worked with. The Spanish that they met there, like they talk a lot about how there's a strong connection between our two countries. You know, we're both on the edges of Europe. We're both under siege by the communists. We both believe in you know, we have the same, essentially the same motto between for God, King, and country versus for faith, Tsar, and fatherland. We have so many connections. We're basically sister countries, and we're fighting the same war. And the Spanish don't buy that at all. Most of the Spaniards that they meet don't even know that there are non-communist Russians. They know very little about the Spanish or the Russian Civil War, and this is devastating to people like T.H.I.N.K who go over there thinking that they're part of this grand struggle and they're going to reorganize the Russian army in Spain and then go and march on St. Petersburg again. Franco barely supports them at all. When he finally grants a meeting with T.H.I.N.K has been trying to get him to organize this Russian unit for months, trying to get a meeting with him. They finally have a meeting, and Franco basically walks in, shakes his hand, says no, and leaves. And T.H.I.N.K is devastated by that. But still, like, so the point being that because of the importance of the Russian Civil War to these people, they've sort of developed this idea in their minds that the Spanish Civil War is not a separate conflict, but it is in fact the same war that's still going on. It's just moved from Russia to Spain. In later chapters in my dissertation, I also expand this to Soviet volunteers in Spain who also see similar connections. Trotsky and his perspective on things, as well as Russian anarchists who go to assist both abroad and in person, the Spanish anarchists in Catalonia. All of these see the conflict in different ways, but they all see this as either a literal or a spiritual continuation of the Russian Civil War, which I think really speaks to the power of that conflict in their lives and the way that it has recontextualized the way that they see their position in the world and the world around them. And I think I will end it there. But thank you very much for coming out to this.
Thank you. you very much, Adam. And we will we'll take questions on both papers at the end, just to make sure we have time. So Aylar, you're up.
Hello, thank you all for coming today. I'd like to acknowledge that this project was developed with Isabel Kinney, who is an undergrad at the Arizona University. So we presented our paper at ASEEES, and this will be more of a recap of what we said. The first half of the project talks about Kyrgyzstan and historical forces that came about, so different revolutions and whatnot, which was more of a focus of Isabel's part on this project. And my project, like the second half of the project, is going to be more of what I investigated. So if you have questions about the first half, I'll do my best, but no promises there to respond to those. Alrighty. So, Kyrgyzstan is notable among the Central Asian countries because of its multiple regime changes and transitions of power on the heels of protests. Elites, including ones brought into power by these changes, have often been seen as guilty of nepotism and corruption, and activist groups have attempted to hold them accountable. These revolutions are an expression of decolonial and nationalist discourses among both activists and the government. Several governments and individuals, like Askar Akayev and Kurmanbek constructed particular narratives around nationalism and manas to reaffirm their powers. But everyday people and activists had different narratives around anti-corruption. In this project, we wanted to explore the decolonial and nationalist discourses in Kyrgyzstan through the lens of those revolutions where the narrative proposed by the government clashes with people's conceptions of nationalism and decolonization. So this is part of the Digital Humanities project. It was funded by REEES think tank, and you can access the timeline that we created with JTSI. I will somehow share the link one way or another, but that project is now live. It's focusing on Kyrgyzstan from 1991 to 2020, with a focus on the revolutions in 2005, 2010, and the protests in 2020 following the election's delay. The first revolution, called the Tulip Revolution, took place in 2005, culminating in then-President Akayev fleeing to Moscow. This escape followed massive protests and the occupation of government buildings, while the government tried to crack down and cut ties with foreign countries and NGOs. The Bakiyev government that replaced Akayev was not necessarily more democratic, and the 2010 revolution was in response to the corruption of that government. The government that came into power afterwards has not faced a similar revolution yet, with a peaceful transition in power in November of 2017. There have been similar accusations of corruption, trials for officials, and sporadic protests throughout the region. The aftermath of the 2010 revolution and the way that it has been remembered is an example of the types of discourses that this project will highlight. In the year after the 2010 revolution, there were celebrations of Manas, an important cultural figure in Kyrgyzstan and the subject of the Epic of Manas. In 2011 and 2012, the Kyrgyz government went on a building spree of Manas statues, including one in Russia where the president declared that Manas was an ethnic Russian. Manas was important politically outside of the revolution in 2009. Akayev celebrated the 1,000 years of Manas in the 1990s, and that was one of the events where he rallied around nation building. And China nominated Manas as an intangible cultural heritage of their Kyrgyz population. So you can already see that there is this clash between Russia trying to claim traditional figures used in the history of these countries. So the national discourse about Manas is key to Kyrgyzstan national image as people with an ancient shared history rather than merely an ex-Soviet republic. This nationalism is therefore tied into the decolonization process, where Russian language, culture, and hegemony on political power are prioritized in favor of Kyrgyz national identity. These discourses are hard to separate from one another because the government discourses are further complicated by the role of authoritarian politics, which can use both discourses to entrench the power of the ruling clique. When Kyrgyzstan became independent in 1991, there was a reckoning with the Soviet legacy that has continued ever since, as it has in the other Central Asian countries. The government, and Akayev specifically, tried to create a new national identity to move forward and encourage unity of the population, which in Kyrgyzstan also included ethnic Uzbeks, Russians, and Kazakhs. This national identity building involved the symbolic panoply of all independent states, a flag, a national anthem, and a coat of arms, and a national language or language policies. In Kyrgyzstan and the rest of Central Asia, this involved replacing Russian loanwords such as replacing the word Soviet with Kanish. This also involved a language requirement to run for office, changing Russian from an official language to unofficial language of communication. Some of these measures worked to assure that control of Kyrgyzstan would not be with Russian elites that were inherited after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but with Kyrgyz people. While in general the structures of the government remain similar to what they had been in the Soviet era, there have been significant changes in Kyrgyzstan with the balance of power between the parliament, prime minister, and president enumerated in the constitution. Kyrgyzstan also works with Russia and China in multinational organizations as a sovereign entity rather than as an extension of Russia. However, Russia and the United States and China have exerted a great deal of influence. Following the invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. built military bases throughout Central Asia, including in Kyrgyzstan. China's Belt and Road Initiative has led to infrastructure projects and debt. The Soviet legacy is definitely still felt through the region, though a great deal has changed in terms of domestic power and the involvement of outside powers. Russia is no longer the exclusive colonizing hegemon, but there are neo-colonial influences that Kyrgyz people are trying to navigate. For instance, the Kyrgyz economy still relies heavily on remittances from labor migrants in Russia, where Central Asians are mistreated, and Russia holds economic, military, and political power through the Eurasian Economic Union. So, for the purposes of this project, we are using Gleason's definition of decolonization, and we define it as the process of transition from foreign economic and political control to local control. It's a process that is well studied in scholarly literature, but we see a gap in the literature analyzing the USSR as a colonizing power. This omission hinders the study of postcolonialism, as some important dynamics associated with decolonization are useful to analyze the post-independence path of Kyrgyzstan. Gleason hypothesized that an important contributor to this trend may be the fact that USSR positioned itself and the ruling class as the good guys standing against the corrupt West. Moreover, even though the USSR might not have viewed Soviet policies as colonizing, the practices the ruling class employed seem to be straight out of the toolkit of seasoned colonizer. For example, the division into the center and periphery, the unequal relationship between the two, have long been observed in the colonizer-colony dynamic. Analyzing the USSR as colonial power can shed light on the nuances of decolonization movements in Kyrgyzstan. We view decolonization not only as a transition of control and power in economic and political spheres, but also rethinking one's identity independent of that of the colonizing power. Decolonization then can also be viewed as a social and cultural process, which will be the significance of the second half of this presentation. Some aspects of such decolonization may include indigenization, which can be described as the increased presence of indigenous people in an institution, industry, etc., that were previously dominated by colonial settlers or their descendants. Decolonization and indigenization go hand in hand in our discussion of these processes in Kyrgyzstan and include reclamation and rethinking of the colonized past, struggle against cultural dependency, as well as popularization of indigenous art, literature, and languages. So we're going to start out with the Epic of Manas. We observe the colonial trends in arts and literature, and then a prominent example of this is the Epic of Manas. Manas is one of the most important literary pieces in Kyrgyz culture. The tale is one of the longest epic poems and has been passed down by generations of Manaschi, or oral performers. The importance of the epic could be observed from the frequency of places bearing the name Manas, from Manas International Airport in Kyrgyz Turkish Manas University to Manas Peak, which is the highest peak in Talas Range, to statue of Manas on Alatu Square, which is the picture that you see up there. It is also very symbolic because before Manas there used to be a statue of Lenin, and now you see more of a national hero signifying, and Alatu Square is an important square because that's where the Kyrgyz parliament resides. The 40 rays of sun illustrated on the Kyrgyz flag are also an influence of Manas as he united the 40 Kyrgyz tribes. We consider popularization of the Epic of Manas as a decolonial act as it was banned during the Soviet rule, except for the excerpts that were conforming to Soviet ideology. Epic of Manas is an important tool in decolonizing the minds of Kyrgyz citizens by helping them better understand their tribal, non-sedentary past. A lot of times during the USSR, Russians were deemed identical to older brother who helped Central Asians transform from savages to educated and civilized people. Soviets long claimed that Kyrgyz history as a nation was started following Soviet entry into Kyrgyzstan in 1917. Manas epic, however, portrays that Kyrgyz history is significantly richer and dates back several centuries. In contrast, Manas helps celebrate the beauty of nomadic past by sharing the story of ancestors, ways of their lives, and their interactions with neighboring tribes and civilizations. Kyrgyz epics show that Manas, along with T.H.I.N.K, and Kurmanbek, made significant contributions to Kyrgyz history and helped better understand Kyrgyz nationhood long before the Soviet invasion, or the Russian invasion for that purpose. Moreover, since indigenization of Kyrgyz school curriculum, Manas is being taught in the social sciences curriculum in contrast to formerly being taught as part of the literature curriculum. This shift allows to foster a stronger sense of belonging among Kyrgyz students while helping rebuild a Kyrgyz identity. I don't know if this video is going to play, but there was an installation honoring the victims of the 1916 upheaval that was revealed at ASEEES Mountains. It was made with metal rods. This installation reveals an image that changes depending on the wind. It portrays a group of people on foot and on camels. During light winds, the group appears to be walking, with the image completely disappearing during strong winds. The installation commemorates the memory of victims who were forced to relocate with no resources or means to survive the passages in the mountains. The author of the installation, Altin Kapalova, mentions that selection of the location on the Zharalgan 2 mountain was intentional, as a 1911 earthquake destroyed a small village located there. The author uses this similarity to portray that Kyrgyz that were forced to run away did not only die at hands of colonizers, but also due to the forces of the nature. And an internet platform with a collection of stories of victims of that upheaval is in the works. Decolonization could also be observed in murals and statues. A mural dedicated to Kyrgyzstan Independence Day was painted on the crossroads of Asmankhul and Frunze streets, which have also since been renamed to give up the Soviet legacy. And a Kyrgyz woman wearing national outfit and holding the Kyrgyz flag is accompanied by the word egomenlik, which translates to independence. But we also see civil society involved in decolonization, and civil society in Kyrgyzstan plays a big role in efforts of rethinking the Soviet past. Research platform ASEEES is a prominent example of interdisciplinary team united by a mission of rethinking the Soviet past. Per their website, ASEEES' main goal is to promote a social shift in understanding the history and memory of Kyrgyz Republic during the period of 20th, 21st centuries. The group studies decolonization and aims to analyze the stories from the past. As the history is written by the victors, ASEEES encourages civil society to share the stories of their grandparents and petitions for state archives to be accessible to researchers and people interested in their past. Aylar and Adam, a researcher with ASEEES, encourages Kyrgyz to collect stories of their families, record them, share, and aid in rebuilding Kyrgyz statehood. Organization's long-term goals include making state archives accessible to scholars and citizens, as well as creating a memorial to illustrate the dark pages of Soviet repressions in Kyrgyz history. ASEEES hosts various exhibitions, scholarly talks, and presentations of their discoveries. Of important note is ASEEES' approach to memory, as the organization understands memory comprehensively. It's not just memories about the people, but also places, things, and events. ASEEES currently provides access to the database of people dispossessed and deported from the territory of Kyrgyzstan to Ukraine from 1927 to 1944. Under leadership of Aylar and Adam, they published 2 volumes of books titled Судьбы and Судьбы 2. Both books explore stories of individuals repressed during the Soviet era. The books attempt to bring voices of individuals to the forefront, in contrast to masses, power elites, and governmental agencies, who would rather not do that, of postcolonial discourse utilizing the method of memory studies. We would like to note that there is a difference in decolonial acts undertaken by the government when compared to civil societies. It appears that top-down decolonial acts undertaken by a government, such as revitalizing Manas, illustrate the triumph and glorious past. And in contrast, the bottom-up process championed by civil society bring the traumatic and grim events to the forefront of the discourse. And this could be evidenced by the works of ASEEES. Russian is still a widely used language in Kyrgyzstan and across Central Asia. Initially, all legal documents were available exclusively in Russian. However, as time has gone, there is a greater conclusion of Central Asian languages into the legal system, general society, and education. Most Central Asian states recognize the importance of abandoning Russian and building a new identity for their citizens by switching to the local language. My native Turkmenistan, for example, switched to Latin script shortly following the independence in 1991. Many activists on Twitter encourage Central Asian to use their national languages, and remarkably, presidents of Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan refused to speak Russian at a pretty recent meeting when they preferred to use their own respective languages. Similarly, many voices on Twitter increasingly call for abandoning the term Kyrgyzia as it reflects the colonial past of Central Asia. And these two tweets are just evidences of that. So the first one translates to that we are a very tolerating nation, but once you arrive, please say Kyrgyzstan and not Kyrgyzia. USSR is not in existence anymore, and we are not in the USSR anymore. And this was in response to many Russian men fleeing the draft and arriving in Kyrgyzstan and referring to the country as Kyrgyzia. And Kyrgyz civil society seems to be very adamant about encouraging people to say Kyrgyzstan, which is the name of the independent country, rather than Kyrgyzia, which used to be part of a USSR. And similarly, I decided just for funsies to look at the search trends in Google, and I saw that Kyrgyzia has historically been a more popular search term in Russia. And this is in stark contrast to use of Kyrgyzstan when looking at searches in the world. Well, that was supposed to be another. But you can see that the blue is worldwide. World refers to Kyrgyzia, Kyrgyzstan, while Russia continues being very adamant about saying Kyrgyzia. And this is also evidence in local journalism and media, even the ones that are more liberal and anti-Putin or anti-Russian nationalism. And then recently there was a story when Zoom, when you register on Zoom, it asks for your country, and for some reason it said Kyrgyzia instead of Kyrgyzstan, so activists in Kyrgyzstan reached out to Zoom, and Zoom seemed to be wanting to fix their mistake and will be updating the name of the country. Another example of decolonization in civil society is an Instagram account called Bashtan Bashtan, and they do really good work. I would highly encourage to follow them if you're interested in following the things that are happening in that space. But essentially what they do is, it's a group run by a younger generation. They try to encourage people to rethink the Soviet past and understand what exactly might have happened, as well as calling for rethinking some events that we celebrate. Recently, February 23rd is the Day of Protector of the Motherland, and it's widely celebrated in post-Soviet countries. I remember when I went to school, the girls would get together, you buy deodorants for men, it's a little celebration. But this organization called people to think about the history of the holiday, which celebrates their army, which is not a thing anymore. It does not have much to do with Central Asian countries at this point. It is somewhat discriminatory because there are women who serve in the military, but traditional this holiday got just turned into the celebration of men. So they like to bring attention to discourses like that. And obviously if you go to comments, there are many pros and cons, and there are people being upset about somebody taking away an extra day off versus people saying that, it's kind of correct to start thinking about these things more critically. Another thing that they did was looking back at the November 8 and 7, which is considered the day of commemoration of the memory of ancestors. And this is when they try to bring out the importance of understanding what events took place during the Soviet era and how these events repressed the Kyrgyz identity and how Kyrgyz ancestors might have been mistreated. And they also encourage the civil society to be as involved as they can. They provided some steps as to what they can do to get better about understanding their past. They encourage people to speak to people who experience these things, as well as share their knowledge. So the big picture here is that when we're looking at the discourse, we see that there are movements from top-down and bottom-up. Top-down being the government enforcing manas, celebrations, and we've noticed that every time that the government attempts to do something, they try to talk about things that are triumphant, that are good, that celebrate the shared history. We haven't really seen the government discourse talking about the repressions or the death or the anything grim. At the same time, we see that the bad and the ugly is brought up by civil society, which once again highlights the importance of having a strong and vibrant civil society that reports on these things, because the government in Kyrgyzstan does not seem to be responsive to people's wants. So we, in our project, determined that government's actions are more nationalistic because the government uses these actions to build this idea of nationhood, while the colonialism is exerted more by civil society. Now, there are certain issues with decolonization, and there's further directions for this project. One of the issues is that there are non-Kyrgyz minorities, and when you have an empire that falls apart and the borders are drawn very theoretically, not given that much consideration about people living in those territories, you get the issues of promoting one group, but then there are other minorities that feel discriminated against and left out. So it is important to balance these things, and we're hoping that we will see more integration going forward. And then, of course, we can't really talk about decolonization when you barely have anything to feed your family with. So the issues of economic and materialist values do take the precedence over these things. And we would be interested in looking at Central Asia at large, and as well as looking at future anxieties due to instability in the region. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is still going on, which is affecting the region, and we will be interested in seeing how this is going to continue influencing. And that they were excited, and that is the end of my presentation.